It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, former Justice Secretary Robert Buckland, Shadow Solicitor General Ellie Reeves, Ash Sarkar of Novara Media and the former Conservative government advisor Mo Hussein. Today, on the receiving end of sexism at Westminster, Labour's deputy leader speaks out.
I was just really crestfallen that a paper, and somebody had said that to a paper and a paper was reporting that.
Westminster is just in a bad place right now. And that story, the way it was written, the idiot of a colleague who apparently gave that quote.
Great Britain sent us this weapon.
The arming of Ukraine. Russia accuses NATO of engaging in a proxy war. And the world's richest man by social media giant Twitter.
No matter who owns or runs Twitter, the president has long been concerned about the power of large social media platforms.
Let's start the programme with showing you a tweet from the website Politico, because the government's taken the unusual step of sending a briefing of what the Prime Minister was expected to say at the Cabinet meeting, which took place this morning. Here it is. He will order the Prime Minister, his senior ministers, to get to grips with the cost of living crisis, squeezing the nation ahead of the local elections. Robert, is Boris Johnson being let down by his ministers in terms of the cost of living crisis?
Well, I would hope that he and his ministers are trying to find every possible means to ease the pressure on households across the country, whether it's reducing tariffs or particular costs to the industry that are then passed on to the consumer. I think we need to go further. I'd like to see a social tariff brought in. I think people who are on key meters paying more per unit for energy is just plain wrong. There's so much more, I think, that we can do, and I would hope that my colleagues in government get on with it and find the solutions as quickly as possible. Up until now, do you think they failed to get a grip of this? Well, I think the £9 billion package to help ease energy costs is a significant help to many hard-pressed households. I think it's right that that action was taken earlier this year, but as the Chancellor said, he's not going to stop there necessarily. He wants to absolutely keep the position under review, and more should be done as and when necessary.
Mo, as a former government advisor, it is quite unusual to send out a long briefing note to let us know what the Prime Minister is ordering his ministers to do. Is the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, being let down by his ministers?
I don't think it's quite right that he's being let down, but this is what you do in Number 10 when you want to show that the Prime Minister's in control, he's getting a grip, he's tackling the biggest issue facing the country, and this is also about widening the pool. So if things do go wrong, there's more people the blame can be put upon. It's not just Number 10 Prime Ministerial thing. But work has been done. I think they could be more creative, and I think there are still tensions with the Treasury in terms of ideas from government being perhaps blocked by the Treasury in terms of spending going forward. So that does need to be looked at as well.
Do you think the purse strings will be loosened then?
I think that's quite likely, and this very public way of doing it is boxing people into corners as well.
All right, well, let's have a look at this headline in The Telegraph. They have a slightly different take, and this is about Labour. Partygate can't distract Labour from cost of living crisis, Shadow Cabinet tells Starmer. Ellie, is Keir Starmer letting down the party and the people by focusing too much on parties and not enough on criticising the government over cost of living?
Absolutely not. I think it's absolutely right that the Labour Party has called out Boris Johnson on Partygate. People up and down the country were sticking to the rules. Those that made the rules were breaking them. But to say that we are not holding the government to account on the cost of living crisis, it is just wrong. Labour have called for...
Well, this is the Shadow Cabinet. This is reporting. Members of the Shadow Cabinet, Lisa Nandy, I think particularly, is cited as criticising the Labour leader for not focusing more on the issues that matter most, she says.
Well, I wasn't at that meeting. I'm not in the Shadow Cabinet. But what I can say is that we have called for an emergency budget to tackle the cost of living crisis. We've called for a windfall tax to reduce people's people's energy bills by £400. We've called for support for small and medium-sized businesses to help with their business rates. We've called to scrap the national insurance hike. So we're talking about the cost of living crisis. We've called for this emergency budget. We want the government to do more.
Yeah. Yes, I know you want them to do more. Ash, I suppose people might look at Prime Minister's questions last week. There was a big interview with Keir Starmer on the BBC Sunday morning show. It was about parties that he focused on. Should Labour be doing more about raising the profile of cost of living issues?
I think it's not just about discrediting the government, it's about Labour presenting a coherent vision which is substantively different from the government. There are some things you mentioned, like the windfall tax, which I think are really good policies, but Labour must go further, because there are two big things that a government can do to deal with the cost of living crisis. It can put money in people's pockets by lifting wages, or it can control prices. This government isn't doing it, and I don't think Labour is going far enough to propose it. You need some big ideas like lifting the minimum wage, nationalising the big six, and reasserting some control, some public control over the direction of the economy.
Mo?
Yeah, I think it's fine that the Labour Party, and you would expect the opposition to do this, capitalising on the mistakes, the mishaps of the government, but actually setting out an alternative vision and being credible in that is what we probably need to hear more from. And I think there are signs of that, but that could be developed further, because it feels like the government getting things wrong is not going to be enough for a credible opposition to continue going with.
Well, I think that's why we've called for an emergency budget. That's why we have set out what we would do. For example, insulating people's homes, which would reduce energy costs. These are the ideas that the Labour Party are coming up with. Yesterday, we made announcements about ending non-dom status, to end that form of tax avoidance and putting money back in to the Treasury. And I think it's really important that we are holding the government to account on these issues, and that's exactly what we're doing.
And isn't that really the reason, partly, that Boris Johnson has had to send out, or rather Number 10 has sent out this long briefing? Is under pressure from the opposition because you're not doing enough on cost of living. An emergency budget might be a good idea.
Well, look, I think he's responding to the reality of the lived experience of people in the country. I do think that it's easy to oppose. It's much more difficult to come up with constructive propositions. But I'd say this about Labour's windfall tax: that will actually destroy investment in the green economy that we need if we're going to get through this sort of spike issue with regard to costs. I think that the government has taken a lot of action on increasing wages. Minimum wage, the living wage increased again in April. So it is wrong to suggest that somehow this government isn't taking direct action to help hard-pressed families. It's happening. More will be done, I am sure, as we go through the year.
So, two things. One is, I'm old enough to remember the spring statement, which was, 3-4 weeks ago. If you're having to convene an emergency cabinet and put out this big briefing, that's a sign that your policy isn't where it should be, and there's been new policy that's come out supposedly and it's not been good enough, and you're now trying to manage the PR fallout. So I think that that's what this long briefing is about. The second thing is about, I think, being bold and taking these big steps. The thing about having a windfall tax is you've got record profits in the oil and gas sector. That's not something which is being passed on to ordinary people. And as for as for the increase in living wage, unless your wage is going up matching inflation or topping inflation, you're getting a pay cut.
Well, that could be 7, 8, 9%, of course.
And that is what most people are feeling.
All right, we're going to move on and talk about the ongoing fallout from the Mail on Sunday piece about Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader. Now, she's been on ITV's Lorraine programme, responding to part of the piece that we didn't actually talk about yesterday, contrasting her debating skills as a comprehensively educated woman up against Boris Johnson's Eton and Oxford educated debating skills. Let's have a listen, because she told Lorraine that she thinks she holds her own against Boris Johnson.
I think I hold my own against Boris Johnson, even more so when we're in the debating chamber. And often I've always felt quite intimidated. I think women from my background do. We always think, oh, they're important, they know more than me. And then you get in the room and you realise, actually, they don't.
No, they really don't.
So you feel more empowered by it. Yeah. But, you know, it is frustrating that people think that about women from my background.
Whose debating skills are more superior, Boris Johnson or Angela Rayner's, Robert?
I think they both got admirable qualities. I think they are quite different in style. I know Angela, I've seen her in the Commons. I think she's a formidable performer. What I think is regrettable is that allegedly one of my colleagues seems to think that it's all right to talk in terms that actually wouldn't have been suitable 100 years ago, let alone in 2022. And I sent a strong message out on social media to condemn that. That sort of language and the sort of media coverage of it as well. Let's not forget it takes two to tango. It really has no place in modern politics. Come on, grow up, move on. It really is not acceptable.
Ellie?
The comments about Angela were disgraceful and despicable. And, my worry is that people shouldn't be able to get away with it. It creates this sense that women can't go into politics for fear of this kind of abuse, and that is completely wrong. We have to end the misogynistic attitude. And actually, this government had an opportunity to make misogyny a hate crime in the Police Courts and Crime Bill, and failed to take that opportunity. That would have sent a really, really strong message that misogyny isn't acceptable in society, and they missed that opportunity.
Well, Ellie, I would say, I was working closely with Stella Creasy and others on this. I mean, the Law Commission didn't actually recommend a hate crime. However, there is clearly urgent work for the police to do to get on with recording incidents of misogyny, and that is what we've got to keep on pressing the government on doing, because you're right, this is a real problem endemic in our society, and it's up to us to get a grip of it as soon as possible. Right. I mean, should it be a hate crime, Mo?
I think it's something that the government should revisit, because it's not going away. There are things in place. When I was in the Home Office, we launched a lot of work on hate crime as well. But if this is not going away and there are more and more cases of it, and it does need to be tackled separately, then it's worth revisiting. Sometimes you have to call things out. You have to put in place regulation for people to be aware this is not OK, this is against the law, and for the police to actually take action. So it could be the stick that is needed. I mean, in terms of the issue of classism, live and kicking, it seems, from this article, Angela Rayner saying it suggested that she was thick because she attended a comprehensive school. What does that say to you?
I mean, look, we all know that Westminster, whether we're talking about the Commons, whether we're talking about the House of Lords, or even when we're talking about lobby journalism, it is dominated by a particular class of people that went to elite universities, people that went to elite public schools. Just 7% of the country's children go to a private school, and yet they dominate the House of Commons. They're overrepresented in the media, they're overrepresented in the House of Lords.
It is changing, of course.
It is changing, but not fast enough. And I think that the kind of comments which were made about Angela Rayner and the fact that they were thought fit to be published shows you that the misogyny and the classism is rife in Westminster. Because I'm not saying that a journalist shouldn't report that an MP said that, but really the story there is MP is misogynist rather than Angela Rayner's turned the chamber into a personal OnlyFans.
But should the story not have been reported? I mean, are you saying it should have been censored in that sense?
I'm not saying it should be censored, but I think that there are problems with the lobby system, because in the lobby system, access for journalists is based on anonymity, and that means that all sorts of rubbish makes it into the public domain because, some boozed up MP or SPAD has whispered it into the right ear at the right time. The job of journalists is to filter out bad information, to select the right story. The story here is misogynist MP, not Angela Rayner, recreating Basic Instinct or whatever, and putting that in the public domain.
Robert?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting debate. Instinctively, I'm cautious about self-censorship, but I do have to ask a question here. In a major Sunday newspaper that has lots of space with lots of readers, surely there are far more important stories out there of real public interest, and the test has to be here. Is it in the public interest to report the comments, the appalling comments about somebody else's look or their appearance, as opposed to what they say and what they think and what the actual debate is? That's what we need to get back to.
But should the messenger here be in the firing line? I mean, the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, called in the political editor who wrote the story and the paper's editor and the chair of the lobby to discuss some of the things that you have all raised. Is that overreach? Was that necessary?
I think that what the Speaker said yesterday in the Chamber was really important. I was sat with Angela in Parliament when the Speaker made his statement, said that he was going to meet with the Mail on Sunday and with the lobby, and I think that sends a really, really clear message that this gutter journalism, and what Lindsay said was that that actually this could actually hinder freedom of speech, this sort of journalism, because it may put people off from going into politics. It could have a chilling effect, and I think that was an important statement for him to make, and I think it sends a clear signal that this sort of gutter journalism, and that's what it was, it isn't acceptable. And I really hope that the Mail on Sunday, and indeed any other news outlet, will think again before putting out this sort of content.
And the unnamed Conservative MP?
Well, whoever they are, they need to be hanging their heads in shame if they think that's a contribution to public debate. It just isn't.
Catapult him into the Thames.
Yeah.
On that, let's catapult onto a completely different subject. Let's talk about Ukraine and the invasion and the war grinding on there. The Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, has been on BBC Breakfast talking about the military hardware that the UK is going to continue to send to Ukraine. Let's have a listen.
If I think about what will arrive in Ukraine from the UK in this 7-day period, 14 armoured vehicles arrived the other day. There are some missile systems that arrived, I think, this morning. There's 1,000 medium-range anti-tank weapons that are arriving. There's 4,000 night vision devices that are arriving. That's not an exceptional week. That's just another week in the MOD supplying Ukraine with as much as we can get our hands on from around the world to give their armed forces the best possible chance of defending their territory and restoring their sovereignty.
James Heappey there. This headline in Mail Online is about Sergei Lavrov, the Kremlin's foreign minister. Russia is at war with NATO, and there is now a real chance the conflict will turn nuclear. He was responding on Russian state television saying exactly that because NATO was acting through a proxy, war means war. Ash, are the UK and NATO going too far in their military support for Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. The reason why Lavrov is taking this tone is because the Russian case for war, as it's been explained to the Russian people, is in tatters. They called it a special operation. It was going to be very limited. It was going to be like the invasion of Crimea. But the story in terms of Ukrainian preparedness and resistance, totally different. The losses of human life on the Russian side and military hardware have far exceeded the expectations that the Kremlin had going into the conflict. So now it's all about turning this into a NATO war of aggression. It is fundamentally misleading. The difficult question for the UK, and I do think this is something to consider now, is countries rarely become more stable after a period of war, after they've been flooded with weapons and artillery. Now, it might be the right thing to do now, but we've got to think about what responsibilities we have to a stable peace, establishing a democracy and making sure that those weapons don't fall into the wrong hands, even after, and hopefully this happens sooner rather than later, the Russian invasion comes to an end.
Robert?
Well, look, I think what this has laid bare is the lie that Russia embarked upon some sort of, security action or police action or a defensive action. This was a war. This was a war of aggression. Now Lavrov is revealing his true fate in the face of Putin's Russia. The idea that somehow that NATO is fighting a war of aggression is a complete opposite of the truth. NATO is a defensive alliance. What we are doing is trying to uphold the principle of self-determination. And to answer the point about the peace, I mean, we are, I suppose, fortunate in this sense that we have a recognised government in Kiev that, in the main, absolutely upholds international norms. We therefore have the opportunity, I think, at the end of all of this, to really get a grip on the sort of proliferation issues that you mentioned and to make sure that those weapons of defence are not brought into the wrong hands. But I do think we have a continuing responsibility. I applaud what the British government has done, not just now, but in the many months leading up to this conflict, both in terms of training and material support. And frankly, we've got to continue doing that in the collective defence of Western values of freedom.
I mean, there will be alarm at the other comment that Sergei Lavrov went on to say, which there was a significant risk of the conflict in Ukraine spiralling into nuclear war. What was your reaction to that, Ellie, in terms of how far the UK should go in sending that military hardware?
I think we've been absolutely right to provide that defensive weaponry to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves against Russian aggression, against the invasion. And we have worked with the government and have said every step of the way that we must be working with our NATO allies to find solutions together. And it's right to send those weapons. So
should we be sending more? Certainly, Volodymyr Zelensky would have liked more hardware earlier, sooner.
I think we should be working with our allies in NATO to make sure that we get the approach right and that we do what we can to support Ukraine in the face of that aggression. And that may mean sending more, but we need to work with our allies to make sure that we support Ukraine in what they're facing.
I mean, the issue is this could go on for months. We've seen previous conflicts. You only have to look at Syria, for example, gone on for years and years. What is the UK's position going to be in terms of that war of attrition with Russia?
I think the UK government will continue to support the Ukrainians, even if there is a Russian victory, so to speak, in terms of supplying weapons to any guerrilla forces or any opposition forces to whichever government might be in charge. And I think that is the right thing to do, because the difference with Syria is we didn't have this level of support, this level of sustained action. And I think once we've started, we do need to continue with it. We need to continue listening to Zelensky, what he actually needs. And all this talk, we've heard it before from the Russians. This is the rhetoric of desperation. You play the nuclear card because you have a domestic audience to shore up. I think actually doing it is a very different ballgame from their perspective.
Was a line crossed, though, yesterday, Ash? The US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin, he was at the press conference after a meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine. He said he wanted to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. Now, that was seen by commentators as going further than the sort of discussion we've had here.
I mean, there has been some reckless talk coming from the Biden White House, from saying Putin can't possibly stay in power to comments like this. I think this is kind of in the realm of fantasy, because unfortunately Putin's position doesn't seem to be hugely weakened by the fact that he's launched this disastrous, bloody war of aggression. I don't think that regime changes on the cards, and I think that if you do end up in a kind of stalemate where Russia isn't able to gain a huge amount more territory, you've just got an enormous loss of life, you're going to have to work out some kind of political settlement, which will not look like the kind of, ticker tape parade Ukrainian win that Austin's talking about, and certainly isn't going to look like the kind of, glorious victory that Putin has promised his domestic audience. And when you get into that messy terrain of, so what is that settlement going to be? I think that words like this might, in fact, hinder finding a peace rather than help it along.
Robert?
Well, I think tempting though it is to try and find a compromise, we're not dealing with a regime in Moscow that seems capable of doing that. They want to annex at least a large part of, if not the whole of the territory. Well, their ambitions are still, they don't believe in the right of the state of Ukraine to exist. How do you negotiate with somebody like that who doesn't accept the basic premise of self-determination? It's very tough.
Right. When he says, Lloyd Austin, weakened to the degree, Russia, that it can't do this kind of thing again, what does that look like in that sense?
Well, look, I mean, I think what he's implying is that we need Russia to come back into the family of nations and to be a rational actor and to behave in a way that is consistent with international law. Now, it doesn't seem that that's going to be possible with this regime. What that precisely means is, of course, going to be up to the Russian people ultimately, not us. But we've got to say these things. We can't. Russia's a member of the P5. It is a major world power in terms of military might. It has to hear a very clear united message from the rest of the world that this behaviour cannot be tolerated.
But saying these things, you have to mean them as well. And I think there's lots of rhetoric, and if the Russians are savvy enough to work out, well, of course, you're going to say that. What does it actually mean? Are you going to back it up with consensus action? Then the words do ring quite hollow, and that is quite dangerous.
But then other members of the P5, like China, need to hear this clear message as well. I think that one of the problems has been that prior to this, the West looked enfeebled, divided, and lacked clarity of purpose. That's changed. There is a very clear, unified purpose now. Be under no illusion, the world has changed. And I think now that we have been faced with a direct challenge to values of freedom and the rule of law and democracy, we are prepared to be collective and stand up to defend them. And that's a very important message.
Right, well, you say the world is unified and the world has changed. Of course, there are notable countries who haven't overtly condemned Russia for its actions. India, where the Prime Minister went last week. Was that a mistake not to be clearer for the Prime Minister to say to India, actually, it's not acceptable to take this stance?
Well, look, if you're going to respect the principle of self-determination, countries have to come to their own conclusion. I would like to see a more robust response from countries like India, most definitely. But if you're going to respect self-determination, then you've got to practice it.
Ellie?
I think that the Prime Minister, you know, when speaking to leaders across the world, does need to make clear that this Russian aggression isn't acceptable, and when thinking about our, you know, relationships, building support for that across the globe is really, really important. Working not just with NATO, but with our allies across the world to firm up that opposition against what Russia is doing.
But India sees things differently and obviously has a different view when it comes to a historic, as they say, relationship with Russia. Would you have expected Boris Johnson to say more?
Well, I wouldn't have, because this is the two-faced hypocrisy at the heart of British foreign policy. Because on the one hand, you're, you know, giving all this powerful rhetoric about, you know, the world has changed, the West is unified with purpose. On the other hand, there's some real politique here, which is Boris Johnson needs a trade deal, so he's gone cap in hand to Narendra Modi, who himself quite likes the idea of a strongman, authoritarian leader who doesn't have respect for international law or the rule of law domestically. And that means that there are some, you know, quite deep moral compromises being made here. So I think that this is a reflection of where British foreign policy is at. I wouldn't have expected Boris Johnson to do anything different, because he's got no interest, I think, in having a coherent and moral foreign policy.
No?
I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity, particularly as the government is talking a lot about supporting Ukraine, showing that kind of leadership again on the world stage. But ultimately, I think Robert is right. You know, if you believe in self-determination, India has its own trade relationships, economic ties with Russia. And is it words that the Ukrainians need, or do they need actual support and actual action?
Let's talk about Twitter, because they have agreed to a $44 billion takeover by Elon Musk, the American entrepreneur and CEO of Tesla. Elon Musk has said he wanted to own and privatise Twitter because he thinks it's not living up to its potential as a platform for free speech. This is what he tweeted: "I hope that even my worst critics remain on Twitter, because that is what free speech means." Do you welcome it, Robert?
Well, I think the interesting story as well is the fact that private equity has been able to claim, you know, a company that's been publicly listed. This is the power now of private equity in the world economy. People can buy what they like. What's going to be interesting is how Elon Musk exposes and brings out into the fore the way in which Twitter uses algorithms in order to work. I think that is good. What I think we need to be somewhat more cautious about is this idea that, in effect, it should be a free-for-all. You know, I'm a Voltairean on freedom of speech, absolutely, but at the same time we know where some of the excesses can lead, and they can lead to real harm being caused to people, not just being offended, but much, much worse than that. And that's why I think we just need to be somewhat cautious about what's happened today, and to work out fully what the implications might be for wider social media platforms as well.
Ellie?
Whoever owns social media platforms, what needs to happen is that people are safe online. we were promised an online harms bill by the government 4 years ago. We still don't have it. Not enough is being done to keep people safe online. You know, there's a real wild west of what happens on these social media.
Well, Elon Musk says it's not enough
platforms.
of a wild west.
Well, you know, the reality is that the way these algorithms work is more extreme content gets shared and amplified through these algorithms, encouraging people to post more and more sort of extreme views. We need to do more to make sure that children are kept safe online, to make sure that disinformation isn't spread, to stop scammers from operating online. And there's been a missed opportunity in terms of the failure to bring forward and get through an online harms bill to protect the online space.
One of the uncomfortable truths for people is that actually algorithms aren't that responsible for the spread of hateful and extremist material. A lot of that comes from organic reach, and it's because Twitter has an addictive structure, right? It makes thirsty maniacs out of all of us, and because of that
Speak for yourself.
But, I mean, if you're on Twitter, you're a thirsty maniac. I'm sorry, and that applies to everybody in this room, most people in politics, most people in the media. And one of the things that happens because you've got this addictive incentive structure built within it is that you have a kind of inherent reward for engaging with more polarising material, angrier material, more extremist material. And so I think one of the difficulties, and this is one of the problems of the online harms bill, is that there's a lot of focus being put on algorithms. What there isn't a focus on is the way in which social media sits in an ecology with legacy media, where more and more extremist views get normalised and all of us get pulled into it. I would like to see a regulated media environment, but it has to be done, I think, correctly, coherently.
What does that mean, Ash, correctly? I mean, a regulator that perhaps agrees or is sympathetic to a particular worldview
No,
or
not
point?
necessarily. So Novara Media, we're very proud to be regulated by Impress, which is the only press regulator to have implemented the recommendations from the Leveson inquiry. This isn't crazy left-wing stuff. This is stuff which has, come from the government itself. I would like to see more media outlets regulated in that way. For instance, the problem with the online harms bill is that it holds the everyday social media user to a higher standard than it does people in the press, because you just have to allege harm rather than have to have proved harm. And I think that is very dangerous for freedom of speech.
Robert?
Well, look, I think the world is watching the UK at the moment with regard to its legislation. This is pretty groundbreaking stuff. And I think, first of all, the fact that it went through a draft process was very important. Parliament's given it a lot of scrutiny. I think there are still questions here about what we mean actually by harm itself, because that is very subjective, and harm is different things to different parts of our society.
But can you really regulate social media companies in the way that you are setting out when you've got someone like Elon Musk who wants to completely allow total freedom of speech?
There is a clear clash here, isn't there, of ideologies, if you like. Look, I think that, Ellie's points about the fact that this isn't just some theoretical thing. There's real harm being caused to people by abuse of social media is something you cannot ignore. The question is how you make sure that we have a space that isn't regulated according to a worldview, but that is a space that is, first of all, accurate. The question of accuracy and verification is a huge thing for the internet. And secondly, doesn't cross the line into criminality. And we have criminal law in our country that's very clear. And I think, therefore, the question of legal but harmful...
Exactly. This legal and harmful content, who and how would it be regulated? I mean, the online harms bill is all well and good, but it's not going to stop Twitter being deregulated in the way that Elon Musk would like it to be.
It won't stop that. And it's something that the government has been working on for a while. When I was there, we were looking at working with tech platforms on counter-terrorism, on horrific child abuse images. And there was a lot of work that the organisations themselves were doing in terms of self-moderation. They're the ones who know the technology. They know how to adapt it and make it better. I think the government has to act begrudgingly because they need to show more progress on this. But it's very difficult because the internet is obviously global, and if you target the bigger platforms, there are many smaller platforms who will pop up and try and do the same thing. So where do you go from there?
I think one of the really interesting things that came out this morning was that Jack Dorsey, who obviously was previously the CEO of Twitter, said that Twitter really shouldn't be a company at all, right? It should be a public good, and that was the biggest regret of his life, was turning this thing that was a public good into a company. And I think that that speaks to much wider problems in our information ecology, because you've got Rupert Murdoch launching his new Talk TV channel. You've got Jeff Bezos, who's bought the Washington Post. You've got Elon Musk having, bought up Twitter. You've got so much of our information ecology, which is so crucial to how democracies function, being bought up by these, capricious billionaires, like in between their
Elon Musk
divorce
says he's
or a bond
committed.
rip, they're like,
Elon
I'm going
Musk
to buy
says he's
this thing.
committed to free speech, total free speech, and surely you're in favour of that in principle.
Total free speech? Well, there are some difficulties there. So am I in favour of a free press? Absolutely. Am I in favour of being able to incite a genocide using social media, which is what happened in the case of Myanmar using Facebook, and Facebook have taken no responsibility for that? Absolutely not. I think the thing that we have to do is think about these things as public utilities, right? They're necessary for the health of our democracy. Therefore, I don't think they can be wholly entrusted into private hands. Right. I don't think that Elon Musk is a responsible custodian, and there's a space for legislation, but
I suppose the question is, who would be a respectable and responsible custodian in that sense? Would you like to see it turned into, as Ash calls it, a public utility?
Well, I want there to be regulation, and that's what a bill could bring in, as long as it's robust enough. I don't want to see children exposed to pornography online, increasingly extreme sites around things like suicide, eating disorders, self-harm. I don't want to see people to be scammed online. You need to have regulation. You need to hold executives, whether that's Elon Musk or whoever else, to account where there has been systematic failures to keep people safe. And that's one of the things that was lacking from the draft online harms bill, was any kind of criminal sanctions for execs of these companies who systematically and repeatedly failed to keep users safe online.
Would that work?
Well, I think the Germans have taken a somewhat more penalty-based approach. I mean, there is existing law, for example, on terrorism, and I think actually does allow sanctions to be imposed of that nature. But, as this bill makes progress, then we've got to tighten it up, improve it and refine it, and that's what we need to use the legislative process for.
All right, let's just point you to this headline in The Times. The former Prime Minister David Cameron has taken aim at critics of the government's anti-terror PREVENT programme. It says. He has written the foreword to a report by the centre-right think tank Policy Exchange, arguing that the PREVENT programme is being undermined by some organisations and that this undermines the fight against terrorism. You can see the headline there. And just to explain that PREVENT is part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy, and its aim is to stop people vulnerable to terrorism or supporting terrorist acts. I'm joined now by Dr. Shazad Amin from the organisation MEND, which stands for Muslim Engagement and Development. Dr. Aziz, what is it about the PREVENT strategy that you object to?
Thank you, Jo. It's Dr. Amin from MEND, yes. Well, basically, we object to PREVENT because for several reasons, really. One is it simply has no evidence base to show that actually it is working. It's discriminatory. You are 8 times more likely to be referred to PREVENT if you're a Muslim than non-Muslim. And it criminalises normative Muslims' beliefs and practices. So, for example, we've had examples of children being referred to PREVENT for watching Arabic news channels. And a man was referred to PREVENT by talking about going to Saudi Arabia. So these are pretty major concerns, really. We don't oppose having counterterrorism strategies, but they should be evidence-based and intelligence-led and formulated with the support of the communities that are most likely to be impacted by them.
All right, well, let me just read to you what David Cameron actually says and argues, because he says, I'm not just talking about violent extremism. No one becomes a terrorist from a standing start. The warped narratives are what draw people in and pave the way for many to support or even commit terrible acts. Therefore, I believe those who refuse to challenge the falsehood surrounding PREVENT are guilty of a form of passive tolerance, whereby society fails to interfere in minority communities for fear of appearing racist. Do you accept that?
Well, look, let's look at basically what this report actually says, yeah? I mean, this report basically only focuses on Muslim groups, and we reject the labels of Islamist and extremists. All this does, it serves to dissuade organisations from talking to us. Many organisations have been critical of PREVENT. Let's look at some of them. Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, for example. Now, is he Islamist and extremist? The Home Affairs Select Committee has been critical of it. Several UN special rapporteurs, Open Society think tank, 140 academics from universities all over the country, including Oxford University, SOAS, Manchester. There's a whole
Dr. Amin, I understand that. But in principle, what is wrong with a government strategy that seeks to try and limit or seek out extremism before it becomes a real problem?
There is nothing wrong with
So why don't you engage with it?
Because basically it's not fit for purpose. I've outlined to you just now all the reasons why it is basically not fit for purpose, because there's no evidence base for it. I mean, for example, Ben Wallace, the security minister a couple of years ago, was asked about what is the government's evidence that Prevent or the Channel programme works. And he simply replied, 500 people have been through the programme. I think my evidence base is I do believe it's working. Now, that's simply not good enough. You can't just have government ministers saying, well, we believe it works, therefore it works.
But people might say, Dr. Amin, what's your evidence that it isn't working?
Well, basically, it's not for us to give that evidence. It's the government's policy, not our policy. Simply being critical of a government policy isn't evidence that you're an extremist or you support terrorism. We're simply articulating the views of a large section of the Muslim community and a whole number of professionals and academics across a number of organisations have said exactly the same thing.
Well, let's put some of your points to Robert Buckland, because you will know the criticisms that it has put suspicion on a whole community. That is the claim, and that some of the measures that have been taken and some of the techniques used are just not fair. They are singling out the Muslim community.
Well, that's just wrong. I mean, in the last year, more referrals have been made on the basis of far-right extremism than so-called Muslim extremism. So this is not a programme that is seeking to single out part of our community in a discriminatory way. What we have to do, unapologetically and robustly, is identify the risk to often children and young people and adults from being exposed to extremism. That's what Prevent does year in, year out. The evidence is clear. There are many hundreds of people who've gone through that programme and have emerged in a way that means that they are not a danger to our society. Yes, there are examples where people have been into the programme and then gone on to commit acts of terrorism, but I think it is frankly, an absurd leap to make to say that just because a programme might offer challenge to certain individuals and their thinking, that therefore there should be non-engagement with it. And it is that message of non-engagement that really we should be challenging robustly. And that's what the report does today. I agree with David Cameron's remarks. I think that more specialism is needed, and that's what I hope the Shawcross review will produce. And certainly from my experience of counter-terrorism in prisons, introducing more special, and I dealt with this as Secretary of State, introducing more specialist and coordinated work with people of terrorist ideation in prisons does actually produce results, and I've seen it for myself.
All right, I mean, Ash, just before you come in, it is true when you look at the number of cases that have been referred, far more are about extreme right-wing radicalisation rather than Islamist radicalisation. They're the most recent figures, which does rather underline Robert's point that this is not something that is aimed at one particular community.
That's very true, but one of the things that you also see if you go through the figures is that 9 out of 10 cases which are referred through Prevent are no further actioned, and you're actually more likely to have action taken if you're on the far right, which tells you that Muslims are being referred on weaker grounds. So, for instance, you've had people who've been referred to Prevent because a primary school pupil drew a picture of his dad holding a cucumber, and someone said, no, that's a cooker bomb. In another instance, a nurse began wearing hijab. These are things which are clearly not leading to violent extremism, pose no threat. And actually, with those cases, you damage the trust between Muslims and the state, and it makes you feel like you are scrutinised, you are being held to an unfair standard. The thing that I would say is that there are cases, the Plymouth shooter being one of them, the killer of David Amos being another, Manchester Arena bomber, London Bridge attacker, they were all referred through Prevent. So if you cast the net so wide that you throw suspicion on a whole community, you damage the trust between the community and the state, and also you've got so much data coming in that you can't identify the threat properly. It's a failed policy being defended, quite frankly, by a failed Prime Minister.
But how do you then seek out potential extremists, Mo? I mean, you used to work in the Home Office. I mean, this isn't an easy thing to undertake. People talk about hate preachers, people talk about online hate. These things take time. People are looking for the signs, aren't they? But do they then risk falling into the trap that's just been outlined by Ash?
No, I think you have to try and get in there early before things get to the position where we sadly had 5 terror attacks when I was in the Home Office, and those are the things that you rightly hear about, but you don't hear about the times when Prevent has actually worked and what has been stopped, because by its very definition, it never happened. I've met a lot of people who were on the programme or who had benefited from the programme who were taken away from that that choice. So it shows that I think it can definitely work. And I think it's also right to challenge misinformation around this and to call it out, because a part of it is consent, it is engagement, it is building up trust with communities.
But hang on, I'm going to get it. I just want
they are being targeted when they're not.
Ellie?
I think it's really important that we have a de-radicalisation programme in place. We're waiting for this long-awaited review into Prevent and whether it's working or not. I'd like to see what is in that review. But there's clearly been some issues with Prevent. For example, the killer of Sir David Amos went through Prevent but was still able to go on to kill. It's really important, though, that we take communities with us and that we're engaging across society. To make sure that communities are on board and on side, and I'm not sure that's happening. But we need to see what's in the review. We need to strengthen Prevent. For example, it's not in prisons. For example, only 1 in 10 people in prison convicted of terrorism are going through a Prevent programme.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you to Dr. Shazad Amin for joining us. That's all we've got time for. I will be back tomorrow for PMQs at 11:15.